At 5 o'clock in the afternoon on October 27, 1962, Captain Second Rank Valentin Savitsky screamed an order. He was in the command compartment of Soviet submarine B-59. This was 300 feet beneath the surface of the Caribbean Sea, 18 miles north of Cuba. He ordered his crew to arm the special weapon. Captain Savitsky was 36 years old. He had served 15 years in the Soviet Navy. He commanded one of the Soviet Union's most advanced diesel-electric submarines. He had been submerged for nearly 3 days without contact with Moscow. The temperature inside his submarine had reached 140 degrees Fahrenheit. The air was thick with carbon dioxide. His crew was near collapse, and the Americans above were dropping what sounded like depth charges directly on top of him. He had 10 seconds to decide whether to launch the world's first combat nuclear weapon. Standard Soviet protocol stated that if a commander believed war had started, he should destroy the enemy. Captain Savitsky gave the order. However, one man aboard B-59 had the authority to override Captain Savitsky. This man had already survived a nuclear disaster that should have killed him. His name was Vasily Alexandrovich Arkhipov. He was 36 years old. He served as flotilla chief of staff. He was equal in rank to Savitsky, but senior by position. Archipov held the third vote required to launch the nuclear torpedo. Savitsky wanted to fire the weapon. Political officer Ivan Maslenikov agreed. The vote was 2-1 in favor of nuclear war. However, Archipov said no. What happened in that sweltering steel tomb beneath the Caribbean that day is the reason any of us are alive to read these words. Held the breaking point. On October 16, 1962, at 8:45 in the morning, President John F. Kennedy was in Washington, District of Columbia. He stared at reconnaissance photographs spread across his desk in the Oval Office. U-2 spy plane images had been taken 2 days before on October 14th. These images were captured from 70,500 feet over western Cuba. The photos showed something impossible. The photographs revealed medium-range ballistic missile sites. These housed Soviet SS-4 and SS-100 missiles. The missiles were nuclear capable. They had a range of 1,200 to 2,500 miles. Launch time from Cuba to Washington was 13 minutes. To New York, it was 10 minutes. Every major American city east of the Mississippi was under threat in less than 20 minutes. The missiles were not operational yet. However, they would be operational soon. The Cold War had been cold for 17 years. Both superpowers had nuclear weapons. Both had long-range bombers. Both knew that total war meant total annihilation. Mutual assured destruction had kept the peace through fear. Now, the Soviets were placing nuclear missiles 90 miles from Florida. President Kennedy had 3 choices. The first option was diplomatic. This involved negotiating with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. He could ask nicely. However, the missiles would become operational while talks proceeded. The second option was a surgical strike. This involved Air Force bombs destroying the missile sites. It would be fast and decisive. However, Air Force intelligence stated that they could not guarantee hitting all the missiles. Any surviving missiles would launch. They would target American cities, resulting in millions dead. The third option was a full-scale invasion. This meant a military assault on Cuba with 180,000 troops. It would lead to complete occupation. This would include the removal of Fidel Castro's government and all Soviet presence. President Kennedy chose none of these options. He chose a naval blockade. The Pentagon called it a quarantine because a blockade was technically an act of war. Nobody wanted to say those words out loud. Starting on October 22nd, United States Navy warships would form a ring around Cuba. Any Soviet ship carrying weapons would be turned back. Any ship that refused would be boarded or sunk. The blockade went into effect on October 24th at 10 o'clock in the morning. The crisis had begun. 300 miles east of Cuba, 4 Soviet submarines were already inside the quarantine zone. Each submarine carried 21 conventional torpedoes. They also carried one other weapon. Nobody on the American side knew about the other weapon. On October 1st, 1962, at 2 o'clock in the morning, operations began in Saida Bay. This was the Soviet Northern Fleet base located on the Kola Peninsula. 4 Foxtrot-class diesel-electric submarines prepared to depart. They were embarking on the longest-range patrol in Soviet submarine history. The mission was designated Operation Kama. Its goal was to establish a covert submarine presence off the coast of Cuba. This presence would support the missile buildup. The submarines included these vessels. One was the B-4, commanded by Captain Ryurik Ketov. Another was the B-36, under Captain Alexei Dubivko. The B-59 was commanded by Captain Valentin Savitsky. Finally, the B-130 was commanded by Captain Nikolai Shumkov. Each submarine measured 295 feet long. They were 25 feet wide and used diesel-electric propulsion. Each had 10 torpedo tubes, 6 in the bow and 4 in the stern. The crew consisted of 78 men. They had a maximum submerged endurance of 5 days on battery power alone. Each submarine carried 22 torpedoes. 21 of these were conventional high-explosive torpedoes. They were standard anti-ship weapons. Each contained 1,000 pounds of TNT. The 22nd torpedo was different. Its designation was the T-5. It carried an RDS-9 nuclear device as a warhead. The yield was 10 kilotons. The Hiroshima bomb that killed 140,000 people had yielded 15 kilotons. This was 2/3 that power. If detonated underwater against a surface fleet, it would create a pressure wave. This wave would be capable of crushing steel hulls within a 5-mile radius. The radioactive seawater would contaminate everything within 10 miles. Surface ships caught in the blast zone would be vaporized. Smaller ships would be tossed like toys. Any survivors would die from radiation within hours. The T-5 had a range of only 10 kilometers, or 6.2 miles. This meant the submarine launching it would likely be destroyed by its own weapon. The Soviets called it a weapon of last resort. The Americans did not know it existed. Soviet protocol for nuclear weapons required 2-man authorization. This meant both the submarine captain and the political officer. Both had to agree. This was the system used on the B-4, B-36, and B-130. However, the B-59 was different. The B-59 carried a passenger, Flotilla Chief of Staff Vasily Arkhipov. He was the commodore of all 4 submarines. He was equal in rank to Captain Savitsky, but senior in the chain of command. His presence on the B-59 triggered a special protocol. 3 officers now had to authorize a nuclear launch. These officers were the captain, the political officer, and the flotilla commander. 3 votes were required. Unanimous consent was necessary. Savitsky did not like this arrangement. This was his submarine. However, orders were orders. The 4 submarines departed Saida Bay on October 1st. Their destination was Mariel, Cuba. The distance was 7,000 miles. The estimated transit time was 18 days. They were supposed to arrive before the crisis started. However, they did not make it in time. The man who should have died. Before understanding what Archipov did on October 27th, we must understand what he survived on July 4th, 1961. That was the day submarine K-19 nearly became the Soviet Union's Chernobyl. Vasily Alexandrovich Arkhipov was born on January 30th, 1926. This was in Staraya Kupovna, near Moscow. Vasily Alexandrovich Arkhipov was born into a peasant family. His father, Alexander Archipov, was a farmer. His mother, Maria Kozyrieva, was a homemaker. He grew up in rural Russia, experiencing poverty and limited opportunities. Archipov did what smart boys from poor families often did. He joined the military. In 1942, at age 16, he enrolled in the Pacific Higher Naval School. The Soviet Navy was expanding and needed officers. They recruited teenagers who were willing to work. In August 1945, at age 19, he served aboard a minesweeper. This was during the Soviet invasion of Manchuria in the final days of World War II. The war ended before he saw combat. He then transferred to the Azerbaijan Higher Naval School and graduated in 1947. His career was steady, unremarkable, and competent. He served in the submarine service with the Northern Fleet. Promotions were based on his performance. By 1961, he was deputy commander of the submarine division. Then, he was assigned to the K-19. The Soviet submarine K-19 had a North Atlantic Treaty Organization codename of Hotel Class. It was the Soviet Union's first ballistic missile submarine. This vessel was nuclear-powered and used cutting-edge technology. However, it was built too fast. It launched in January 1959 and was commissioned in November 1960. The submarine was plagued with problems from day one. The crew nicknamed it Hiroshima. On July 4, 1961, the K-19 was conducting exercises. These took place in the North Atlantic between Greenland and Iceland. The submarine was at a depth of 300 feet. Suddenly, an alarm sounded. There was a reactor coolant leak. It was not a small leak. Instead, it was a catastrophic rupture in the primary coolant system. The reactor's cooling pipes had failed. Without coolant, the reactor core would overheat. This meant the nuclear fuel rods would melt down. Without coolant, the K-19 would become a nuclear bomb. The submarine carried 3 nuclear-tipped ballistic missiles. If the reactor overheated enough to detonate them, the explosion would rival a small nuclear war. Emergency procedures required the submarine to surface immediately. The crew should evacuate if possible. They also needed to radio for help. The backup cooling system did not work. It had never been properly installed. Soviet shipyards had rushed construction, cutting corners. Safety was secondary to the schedule. The reactor temperature climbed to 800 degrees Celsius. It then reached 900 degrees. The melting point of the reactor vessel was 1100 degrees. Captain Nikolai Zatayev made a decision. The engineering crew would improvise a jury-rigged cooling system using seawater. This required manual operation. It meant someone had to go into the reactor compartment in person. They would need wrenches and welding equipment, even while the reactor was melting down. Vasily Arkhipov was deputy commander. He volunteered to lead the repair team. The temperature inside the reactor compartment was 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Radiation levels were lethal within 10 minutes of exposure. The men worked in shifts. They spent 6 minutes at a time inside. Then they staggered out, vomiting and bleeding from their mouths and noses. They rigged a makeshift cooling loop. Seawater was pumped through pipes welded to the reactor housing. The system worked, but barely. The temperature stabilized. The submarine surfaced. Eventually, Soviet ships arrived and towed the K-19 back to base. Faint members of the engineering crew died within a month. They suffered from acute radiation poisoning. Their organs liquefied and skin peeled off in sheets. These were agonizing deaths. 15 more crew members died within 2 years. They succumbed to cancer, leukemia, and kidney failure. Vasily Arkhipov absorbed a radiation dose high enough to kill him, eventually. The radiation lodged in his bones, his organs, and his DNA. It would take 37 years, but it would kill him. He died of kidney cancer on August 19, 1998, at age 72. However, in October 1962, he was still alive. He was still serving and still healthy enough to command. The Soviet Navy awarded him the Order of the Red Banner for his actions on the K-19. They also assigned him to flotilla command. He had proven something invaluable in the submarine service. He could make life or death decisions under unimaginable pressure. That quality would be tested again 16 months later. If you want to see how the United States Navy almost triggered World War III, then like this video now. It tells the platform to show this story to more people who need to hear it. And trust me, what happens next is worth staying for. On October 23, 1962, at 6 o'clock in the evening, the B-59's position was 500 miles east of Cuba. It was running submerged at 100 feet depth. Radio contact with Moscow was intermittent. The submarine's communication equipment required surfacing to receive messages. However, surfacing during daylight was dangerous. American reconnaissance planes patrolled constantly. Therefore, the plan was to surface only at night, receive orders, and submerge before dawn. On October 24th, at 10 o'clock in the morning, the United States naval quarantine went into effect. The B-59 did not know this. They had last received radio contact on October 22nd. The message instructed them to proceed to Cuban waters. They were to maintain a covert presence and avoid detection. Further orders were to follow. No further orders came. However, on October 22nd, after President Kennedy's televised address announcing the quarantine, the Soviet Navy sent an urgent message. This message went to all 4 submarines. It ordered them not to surface. They were to remain submerged and avoid contact with United States forces. They were also to await further instructions. The B-59 never received this message. They were too deep. Their communication window had closed. On October 25th, American anti-submarine warfare forces detected something on sonar. It was a submarine signature, identified as Foxtrot class. Its designation was Contact Sierra 1. The submarine's position was north of Cuba, inside the quarantine zone. The United States Navy deployed a hunter-killer group. This group came from the aircraft carrier, United States ship, Randolph CVS-15. The task force included 11 destroyers. It also had anti-submarine warfare helicopters and S-2 tracker aircraft. These aircraft were equipped with sonobuoys. Their orders were to locate Soviet submarines. They were to force them to surface. Then they were to identify and track them. The standard North Atlantic Treaty Organization procedure for forcing submarines to surface involves dropping practice depth charges. These are small explosive charges. They are loud but non-lethal. They create a massive underwater shock wave. This sends a clear message to the submarine, indicating its detection and requesting it to surface for identification. The United States Navy had briefed Soviet naval attachés in Moscow about this procedure months earlier. Practice depth charges would serve as signals, not as weapons. They would explode far enough away to avoid causing damage. This was standard peacetime protocol. However, the crew of the B-59 did not know this information. They had not received the briefing. They had not been in port when the protocol was explained. All they knew was that American warships were hunting them. Now explosives were detonating around their submarine. It was October 27, 1962, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The B-59 had been submerged for nearly 60 hours. This was far beyond its safe operating limits. Only 8% of battery power remained. Once the batteries depleted, the submarine would have to surface. This was necessary to run the diesel engines and recharge. That meant exposing themselves to the entire American fleet waiting above. Air quality had become critical. Carbon dioxide levels were approaching toxicity. Every breath felt like inhaling fire. Men lay motionless to conserve oxygen. Some crew members had already passed out. Temperatures ranged from 113 to 140 degrees Fahrenheit. This depended on the compartment. The engine room alone reached 140 degrees. The crew stripped to their underwear. Sweat poured off them. Dehydration soon set in and some men began to hallucinate. The submarine was at a depth of 300 feet. It was operating at its maximum safe depth to avoid detection. Captain Valentin Savitsky was 36 years old. He had 15 years of experience in submarines. He was an aggressive, proud combat officer trained to fight, not retreat. He had been running from American destroyers for 2 days. His submarine was dying around him. His crew was suffering greatly. His orders stated to avoid contact. However, they did not specify what to do if contact became unavoidable. Then, the depth charges started. At 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the first explosion occurred. The blast shook the entire submarine. Steel groaned loudly. Light bulbs shattered. Equipment fell from shelves, and men were thrown against bulkheads. In the American ships above, the United States ship Beale, designation DD-471, had just dropped a practice depth charge. This was a practice depth charge Mark 44. It had an explosive yield of 5 pounds of trinitrotoluene. It was designed to create noise, not damage. This charge was dropped 300 yards from the submarine's estimated position. Inside the B-59, it sounded like the world was ending. At 5:03 o'clock in the afternoon, the second explosion occurred. This explosion was closer. The submarine rolled 15 degrees. Emergency lights flickered. Crew members screamed. At 5:07 o'clock in the afternoon, the third explosion hit. The hull vibrated like a struck bell. Savitsky grabbed the intercom and shouted for battle stations. The crew scrambled into action. Weapon stations were manned. Torpedo tubes were flooded. Target acquisition systems powered up. In the command compartment, 3 men stood in a triangle formation. One was Captain Valentin Savitsky, commander of the B-59. His face was red. His uniform was soaked with sweat. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from heat exhaustion. He had been awake for 40 hours straight. He declared that they were under attack. He believed war had started, and they had orders to respond with all available weapons if attacked. Another was political officer Ivan Semyonovich Maslenikov. He was 38 years old and the Communist Party representative. His job was to ensure ideological purity and strategic compliance. He also had to co-authorize any nuclear weapons launch. His face was pale. He nodded, concurring with the captain and ordering the special weapon armed. The third man was Vasily Arkhipov, flotilla chief of staff. He was 36 years old. He remained quiet and calm. His uniform was also soaked with sweat, but his expression remained unreadable. Savitsky turned to him, stating that they required his authorization. At 5:08 o'clock in the afternoon, the fourth explosion occurred. This one felt as though it hit the hull. It did not actually hit, as it was 400 yards away. However, in the sensory deprivation of a submerged submarine, distance is impossible to judge. Savitsky shouted over the noise that they were trying to sink them. He added that they had to respond. The special weapon was their only chance. The T-5 nuclear torpedo sat in tube number 2. It was 21 feet long. It was 21 inches in diameter and weighed 4,000 pounds. The Romeo Delta Sierra 9 warhead had a yield of 10 kilotons. It was armed and ready. The target was the United States ship Randolph. This was the aircraft carrier leading the anti-submarine warfare group. It displaced 50,000 tons and had a crew of 3,000 men. Its current position was 8 miles north of the B-59. The launch sequence for the T-5 required 3-step authorization. First, the captain confirmed the target and tactical necessity. Second, the political officer confirmed strategic authorization. Third, the flotilla commander confirmed compliance with operational doctrine. All 3 officers had individual keys. All 3 had to insert and turn them simultaneously. Savitsky inserted his key. He turned it to the armed position and declared, "Ready." Maslenikov also inserted his key. He turned it, stating he was ready. Archipov stood in front of the third keyhole. He was not moving. Savitsky urged, "Vasily, your key. Now." The temperature in the command compartment was 120 degrees. The smell was a mixture of sweat, diesel fuel, human waste from overflowing toilets, and fear. Another explosion sounded, this one closer. It was the 5th explosion in 6 minutes. Archipov spoke quietly, saying, "No." Silence filled the compartment. Maslenikov asked, "What?" Archipov explained that they did not know if war had started. They had not received orders from Moscow. He suggested the explosions could be signals, not attacks. Savitsky, now shouting, exclaimed that they were trying to kill them. He questioned if these were truly signals. Archipov countered that if the Americans wanted to kill them, they would already be dead. He argued that those were small charges, merely warning shots. Savitsky retorted that Archipov did not know that. Archipov replied that Savitsky also did not know if war had started. At 5:12 o'clock in the afternoon, the 6th explosion occurred. The lights went out. Emergency lighting engaged, casting a red glow. Everything looked like blood. Savitsky's voice broke as he pleaded with Vasily. He explained that his crew was dying. They were out of air and out of power. They could not stay submerged. He feared that if they surfaced, the Americans would capture them. The Americans would take their submarine, their codes, and everything else. They had to fight. Archipov, still calm, stated that launching that torpedo would guarantee war. He noted that Moscow might not even know there was a crisis yet. He warned that they could start World War III because they panicked. Maslenikov argued that their orders stated to respond to an attack with all available weapons. He believed this was an attack. Archipov countered that their orders also stated to avoid contact and await further instructions. They had not received further instructions. He insisted they must surface, make contact with Moscow, and find out if war had started. Then they would follow orders. Savitsky, barely holding back tears, asserted that the Americans would sink them when they surfaced. Archipov replied that they would then die without starting a war. The two men stared at each other. The submarine groaned. Another explosion occurred, the seventh, followed by the eighth. A total of 12 depth charges were dropped between 5 o'clock in the afternoon and 8 o'clock in the evening. The United States ship Beale dropped them according to standard procedure. This involved 5-minute intervals, with increasing proximity, until the submarine surfaced. At 8:47 o'clock in the evening, the B-59's batteries reached 3%. Savitsky made the decision to surface the boat. At 9 o'clock in the evening on October 27, 1962, the B-59 blew its ballast tanks and rose toward the surface. The crew braced for an attack. Torpedo men stood ready at their stations. If the Americans opened fire the moment the B-59 surfaced, Savitsky was prepared to fire all conventional torpedoes. The submarine broke the surface. Darkness enveloped them, along with rough seas. Wind and rain came from a Caribbean storm system. Surrounding the B-59 in a perfect circle were American warships. These included the United States ship Beale, the United States ship Coney, designation DD-508, and the United States ship Murray, designation DD-576. There were 11 destroyers total. Searchlights bathed the B-59 in white light. Helicopters hovered overhead with loudspeakers. The message, broadcast in Russian, asked if they needed assistance. The B-59's crew opened the conning tower hatch. Fresh air rushed in. Men gasped for breath. Some vomited from the sudden temperature change and oxygen influx. Savitsky climbed to the bridge. Archipov followed him. Behind them, crew members stumbled onto the deck. They gulped air and collapsed against railings. The American ships kept their distance. They made no aggressive maneuvers. There were no guns trained on the B-59. There were just searchlights and the repeated message asking if they needed assistance. It was not an attack. It was a signal. Savitsky told Archipov that he had been right. Archipov replied that he had not known for sure. He had guessed. They stayed on the surface for 7 hours. During this time, they recharged batteries. They also ventilated compartments and radioed Moscow. The American warships maintained their cordon. However, they made no attempt to board or interfere. At 4 o'clock in the morning on October 28th, the B-59 submerged again. This time, they had new orders from Moscow. The orders stated to withdraw from Cuban waters, return to base, and that the crisis was being resolved diplomatically. Kennedy and Khrushchev had reached an agreement. The Soviets would remove missiles from Cuba. The Americans would publicly promise not to invade Cuba. They would also secretly agree to remove Jupiter missiles from Turkey. The crisis was over. The B-59 limped back to the Soviet Union. They arrived on November 11th. The entire crew was debriefed. Then they were confined to quarters for 3 months. Their mission had been a failure. They had been detected. They had been forced to surface, and they felt humiliated. Soviet Naval Command considered court-martialing Savitsky. This was for allowing his submarine to be detected and cornered. However, they did not. They did, however, remove him from submarine command. They then reassigned him to a desk job. Archipov received no commendation. His refusal to launch the nuclear torpedo was never officially acknowledged. In Soviet records, the incident was buried. It was classified and forgotten. He continued his naval career. He became a rear admiral in 1975. He was appointed head of the Kirov Naval Academy. He achieved vice admiral rank in 1981. He retired in 1988. He never spoke publicly about October 27, 1962. He did not speak of it until 2002. In October 2002, a conference was held in Havana, Cuba. This conference marked the 40th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis. American and Soviet veterans gathered to discuss what had really happened in October 1962. For decades, both sides had kept secrets. Now, with the Cold War over, some truths could finally be told. Former United States Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara sat in the audience. He had been Kennedy's closest advisor during the crisis. He thought he knew everything that had happened. He did not. A Russian naval officer, Vadim Orlov, took the stage. He was a former signals intelligence officer aboard the B-59. He began describing the submarine's experience during the crisis. Then he revealed that they had been carrying nuclear torpedoes. He explained that each of the 4 submarines had one T-5 torpedo with a 10-kiloton warhead. The room went silent. McNamara stood up, asking, "What?" He stated that they had not known that. He emphasized that they had no idea their submarines had nuclear weapons. Orlov responded that the Americans had been dropping depth charges on them. He said they had thought war had started. Captain Savitsky had ordered the nuclear torpedo armed. 2 officers agreed, but Vasily Arkhipov refused. McNamara, visibly shaken, asked if Orlov was saying that one man stopped them from launching a nuclear weapon at their fleet. Orlov nodded in confirmation. McNamara sat down. His hands were shaking. He later told reporters that they had come within a hair's breadth of nuclear war without even knowing it. He warned that if those submarines had launched, they would have retaliated. The Soviets would then have responded, and that would have been the end. Thomas Blanton, director of the National Security Archive, later calculated the probable chain of events if the B-59 had launched the T-5. At minute 0, a nuclear torpedo would detonate beneath the United States ship Randolph. The aircraft carrier would be destroyed. 3,000 sailors would be killed instantly or die from radiation within hours. At minute 5, surviving American warships would detect the nuclear detonation signature. They would believe the Soviet Union had initiated nuclear warfare. At minute 15, the United States Strategic Air Command would be notified. Defense. Condition 1 would be declared. Nuclear bombers would launch toward Soviet targets. At minute 30, Soviet early warning systems would detect American bomber formations. They would assume the attack they had been expecting had begun. At minute 60, Soviet intercontinental ballistic missiles would launch. American intercontinental ballistic missiles would launch in response. At minute 90, the first nuclear weapons would detonate over Moscow, Leningrad, Washington, New York, and dozens of other cities. By day 1, 100 million people would be dead. By week 1, 500 million would be dead from direct effects and fallout. By month 1, a global nuclear winter would begin. This would cause crop failures and famine. By year 1, survivors would envy the dead. One man stopped that timeline. He did so by saying no. The B-59 was not the only close call on October 27, 1962. At 12 p.m., a United States U-2 spy plane, piloted by Major Rudolph Anderson, Jr., was shot down over Cuba. A Soviet SA-2 missile, a surface-to-air weapon, destroyed the plane. Anderson was killed instantly. He was the only combat casualty of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Joint Chiefs of Staff urged Kennedy to retaliate immediately. They recommended full airstrikes and an invasion within 48 hours. Kennedy refused their advice. He ordered no military response. Instead, he gave Khrushchev one more chance to stand down. At 2 p.m., another U-2 plane accidentally strayed into Soviet airspace over Siberia. Soviet MiG fighters scrambled to intercept it. American F-102 fighters, armed with nuclear air-to-air missiles, scrambled to escort the U-2 home. The two groups of fighters came within visual range of each other. This happened before the U-2 made it back to Alaska. Later that day at 5 p.m., the B-59 submarine nearly launched a nuclear torpedo. These were three separate incidents. Any one of them could have triggered World War III. October 27, 1962, has been called Black Saturday. It was the single most dangerous day in human history. We survived it because of decisions made by individuals. These people acted under unimaginable pressure. Rudolf Anderson died while flying his mission. He could not refuse orders. He was posthumously awarded the Air Force Cross. It was the first such award ever given. The U-2 pilot over Siberia got lost because his navigation equipment malfunctioned. He eventually made it home. We do not know his name. It remains classified. But Vasily Arkhipov refused. The date was August 19, 1998. The location was Zheleznodorozhny, Moscow Oblast, Russia. Vasily Alexandrovich Arkhipov died of kidney cancer at the age of 72. The radiation exposure from the K-19 incident in 1961 had finally killed him. It took 37 years, but the cancer eventually caught up. He was buried in Savinsky Cemetery. His wife Olga and daughter Yelena attended the service. It was a small ceremony with retired naval officers present. He received no state honors or public recognition. The Soviet Union had never officially acknowledged what he did in 1962. The B-59 incident remained classified. This secrecy lasted until the 2002 Havana conference. By then, Archipov had been dead for 4 years. He never sought recognition for his actions. His wife Olga later described him as intelligent, polite, and very calm. She said he did not talk much about his service. He believed he was simply doing his job. On October 27, 2017, 55 years after Black Saturday, the Future of Life Institute awarded Vasily Arkhipov the inaugural Future of Life Award. The citation honored him for preventing nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He refused to authorize the launch of a nuclear torpedo. This decision was made despite extreme pressure from his captain. He also endured nearly unbearable conditions aboard submarine B-59. His daughter, Yelena, and his grandson accepted the award. The prize included $50,000 and a medal. The Institute also issued a statement. It declared that Vasily Arkhipov might be the most important person in modern history that many have never heard of. Today, at the Russian Naval Academy and the United States Naval War College, the B-59 incident is taught as a case study in decision-making under pressure. Students learn how close the world came to nuclear war. They also learn why an assumption of hostile intent nearly caused catastrophe. Furthermore, they study how one individual's restraint prevented escalation. The importance of communication protocols during crises is also a key lesson. Archipov's name appears in 14 books about the Cuban Missile Crisis. It is also found in 8 documentaries and dozens of academic papers on nuclear deterrence. His story is included in United States Navy training materials on crisis management. No monuments bear his name. No statues commemorate his decision. He is not in any history textbook used in American schools. However, 8 billion people are alive today, in part because he kept his hand away from that key. Let us be specific about what Vasily Arkhipov prevented. Imagine if B-59 had launched the T-5 nuclear torpedo on October 27, 1962. The United States ship Randolph would have been destroyed. Its crew consisted of 3,000 men, aged from 18 to 45. These were sailors from every United States state. Some had families waiting at home. Others were just young individuals who had joined the Navy to see the world. None of them knew how close they came to dying that night. Seaman Michael Peterson was 19 years old and from Montana. He was on lookout duty on the United States ship Coney when the B-59 surfaced. Years later, at the 2002 Havana Conference, He met Vadim Orlov. Orlov was the Russian signals officer from the B-59. Orlov informed him that they had almost launched a nuclear weapon at his ship. Peterson responded that he had no idea of the danger. He said he was just a kid. He thought they were helping the submarine surface because it was in distress. That is how close it was. The American sailors thought they were performing a rescue operation. The Soviet submariners thought they were under attack. Neither side understood what the other was doing. War does not start because nations plan it. War starts because people misunderstand each other in the dark. The nuclear exchange that would have followed the B-59's launch would have caused immense casualties. 3,000 sailors on the United States ship Randolph would have died immediately. The 78 submariners on the B-59 would have also perished. Their submarine would have been destroyed by its own torpedo or by American retaliation. Within the first hour, 35,000 American military personnel in Cuba and surrounding waters would have been killed. American nuclear retaliation would have led to the deaths of 200,000 Soviet military personnel in Cuba and on Soviet vessels. 10 million Americans in United States cities would have died in the first nuclear strikes within 6 hours. 15 million Soviets in Soviet cities would have died within 12 hours. Within the first week, 100 million people would have died from direct effects. 500 million people would have died within the first month from fallout and radiation. 3 billion people would have died within the first year due to famine, nuclear winter, and societal collapse. These are not just numbers. They are fathers, mothers, and children. They are people with lives, dreams, and futures. All of them would have been erased because 3 men in a steel tube beneath the Caribbean made a decision. 2 of those men said yes. 1 man said no. That is why we tell this story. 62 years later, the world has more nuclear weapons than it did in 1962. Russia has 5,977 warheads. The United States has 5,428. France possesses 290, while China has 410. The United Kingdom holds 225 warheads. Pakistan has 170, and India has 164. Israel is estimated to have 90. North Korea is estimated to have 40. The total is over 12,500 nuclear warheads. Any one of these could be launched by mistake. This could happen due to miscommunication. It could also occur if someone assumes the worst instead of confirming facts. The B-59 incident teaches us several lessons. First, communication prevents war. The United States Navy had informed Moscow about the practice depth charge protocol. However, that information never reached the B-59. Operational security prevented real-time communication. The submarine was blind and deaf, which nearly killed millions of people. Second, individuals matter more than systems. Soviet protocol required 3 officers to authorize a launch. The system worked only because 1 man refused. If Archipov had not been aboard, or if the B-59 had only needed 2-person authorization like the other submarines, Savitsky and Maslenikov would have launched. The system only works if the right people are in place. Third, restraint under pressure is the hardest decision. Archipov had every reason to say yes. His crew was suffering and his captain was desperate. The explosions felt like real attacks. Saying no meant gambling that the Americans were not trying to kill them. If he had been wrong, his entire crew would have died. He would have been blamed for not defending them. But he said no anyway. That kind of courage, the courage to not act, to wait, and to endure, does not get statues built. It does not get medals pinned on uniforms. It just saves the world quietly and goes home. Fourth, nobody wins a nuclear war. If the B-59 had launched, the Soviet Union would have been destroyed. So would the United States. Most of human civilization would also have been destroyed. There would have been no victory parade in Moscow. There would be no ticker tape parade in New York. There would only be ash and silence. Archipov understood this truth. He had seen what radiation does to human bodies. He had carried his dying crewmates from the K-19's reactor compartment in 1961. He knew that nuclear weapons do not discriminate between soldiers and civilians. They do not distinguish between enemies and bystanders. He knew that using the T-5 meant everyone would lose. So he refused. Vasily Arkhipov saved the world on October 27, 1962. His reward was no commendation and no promotion. He continued service in a Navy that never acknowledged what he had done. He had a quiet retirement. He then experienced a slow death from radiation-induced cancer. He died believing he had simply followed regulations. That is what he told his family. That is what he told the few people he ever discussed it with. He maintained he was following protocol. He said 3 officers had to agree, and he did not agree. That was all. He never claimed to have saved the world. He never sought recognition. When the story finally became public in 2002, 4 years after his death, his wife Olga commented. She said Vasily would have been embarrassed by all this attention. She added that he was just doing his duty. His duty was to prevent nuclear war. And he did. The politicians in Washington and Moscow negotiated publicly. Kennedy and Khrushchev exchanged carefully worded letters. The world watched and prayed for peace. However, the real decision happened in darkness, 300 feet underwater. It took place in a steel tube full of dying men. One man said no, and 8 billion people never knew they owed him their lives. If this story mattered to you, please do something for me right now. Please hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube's algorithm to show this story to more people. Stories like this do not get told unless people like you make them visible. Please hit subscribe and click the notification bell. We are pulling stories like this from declassified archives, forgotten files, and historical records every single week. These are real decisions with real consequences. They involve real people who changed history by doing what others would not. Please drop a comment right now. Tell me where you are watching from. This story belongs to everyone, whether you are in the United States, the United Kingdom, Russia, or India. Let me know if you had heard of Vasily Arkhipov before today. You can also tell me if you have ever visited a Cold War museum or a submarine, or just type "never forget" so we know you are here. You are not just a viewer. You are part of making sure Vasily Arkhipov is not forgotten. You are part of making sure the next generation understands how close we came. You are also part of showing how one person's courage saved everything. Our community is growing. We have viewers from over 120 countries. Every single one of you matters. One more thing, please share this video. Text it to someone who needs to hear this. You can post it on Facebook or tweet it. This story deserves a bigger audience than it currently receives. Thank you for watching. Thank you for making sure Vasily Arkhipov is remembered. Thank you for understanding that heroes do not always get medals. Sometimes they simply say no when everyone else says yes. And sometimes that is enough to save the world. See you in the next story.